The mining colony on Dracus 4 was a place where the boundaries of survival and ingenuity blurred daily. The air was thick with the scent of metallic dust, and the landscape was a harsh, unforgiving expanse of rocky terrain punctuated by massive mining rigs. This planet was home to a diverse population of humans and aliens, all drawn to the mineral riches that lay beneath the planet's surface. Among them was Cade Wallace, a human mechanic whose reputation as an outsider was almost as notorious as his skill with machines. Cade was not like the other engineers. His unkempt appearance, often streaked with oil and dust, coupled with his quiet, introverted nature, made him an easy target for ridicule. The other mechanics, both human and alien, dismissed him as a strange recluse who preferred the company of machines to people. They were not entirely wrong. Cade found solace in the precision of mechanics, where problems could be solved with the right tools and equations, and where emotions played no part. He worked in a small, cluttered workshop on the outskirts of the colony, far from the bustling central hub where most of the engineers and technicians gathered. His workspace was a chaotic mix of half-disassembled machinery, prototype gadgets, and tools that no one else seemed to understand. Cade spent most of his time here, tinkering with devices that others had long given up on, creating innovations that went unnoticed because he rarely bothered to showcase them. Despite his isolation, Cade was known for one thing: he could fix anything. Whether it was a malfunctioning mining drone, a damaged transport shuttle, or a complex piece of alien technology, Cade had an uncanny ability to bring machines back to life. But his methods were unconventional. He often used parts from other machines, reprogrammed components, and applied principles from different fields in ways that baffled other engineers. To them, Cade's work was more akin to witchcraft than science. This reputation as a mechanical savant did little to endear him to the colony's inhabitants. The Yavani, in particular, viewed him with suspicion. Their culture valued harmony and tradition, and Cade's improvisational style clashed with their precise and methodical approach. To them, he was a wild card, a human who did not adhere to the established norms. Even among his own species, Cade was seen as an oddity. The human engineers were more interested in maintaining the status quo than in pushing boundaries, and Cade's innovative mind was often seen as a threat to their comfortable routines. One evening, as Cade was engrossed in the repair of an old mining drone, he was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, an unusual occurrence in his secluded workshop. It was Jorak, a Yavani engineer who had always regarded Cade with a mix of disdain and curiosity. The Yavani were a tall, slender species with crystalline skin that shimmered under the faint light of the workshop, their multifaceted eyes reflecting every color in the spectrum. Jorak's presence was a clear sign that something was amiss. "We need your help, human," Jorak said, his tone clipped and formal. Cade looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's the problem?" "There's been an accident in the mines," Jorak replied, his voice betraying a hint of urgency. "The chief's daughter, Kale, was caught in a cave-in. Her core has been damaged." Cade frowned, setting down his tools. The Yavani's crystalline core was the center of their being, a complex organ that combined biological and technological elements in a way that no human fully understood. Damage to the core was almost always fatal, and human medical knowledge was of little use in such cases. "Why come to me?" Cade asked, genuinely puzzled. The Yavani had their own healers, experts in their unique physiology. They had never sought his help before, especially not for something as delicate as this. Jorak hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Our healers have done all they can, but the damage is beyond their ability to repair. The core is fracturing and Kale's life force is fading. You are the only one who might be able to fix it." The weight of the words hung in the air, and Cade felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The idea of trying to repair a Yavani core was daunting. He had never attempted anything like it before, and the risk of failure was immense. But there was something in Jorak's eyes, a desperation that Cade had never seen in the usually composed Yavani. "I'll need to see the damage first," Cade said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "And I'll need access to your tools and materials." Jorak nodded, relief flickering across his crystalline face. "You will have whatever you need. But understand this, human. If you fail, it will be on your head. The Yavani will not forget." Cade understood the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just taking on a repair job. He was stepping into a cultural and political minefield. But there was no turning back now. If there was even a chance he could save the child, he had to try. As Cade followed Jorak out of his workshop and into the night, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the colony's eyes on him. The air was heavy with dust and tension, and the path ahead seemed more uncertain than ever. For the first time in his life, Cade Wallace, the outcast mechanic, was about to take on a challenge that could change everything, both for himself and for the fragile peace that held the colony together. As they approached the Yavani Temple, a towering structure of crystal and stone that shimmered under the twin moons of Dracus IV, Cade steeled himself for what was to come. The task before him was monumental, perhaps impossible. But Cade had spent his life defying the odds, and now, more than ever, he would need every ounce of his skill, ingenuity, and determination. Because this time, failure wasn't just an option, it was a death sentence. The Yavani Temple, where Cade now found himself, was unlike any structure he had ever seen. It was a breathtaking fusion of art and engineering, with walls made of translucent crystal that seemed to pulse with an inner light. The entire structure resonated with a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a living organism. The temple was sacred to the Yavani, a place where technology and spirituality intertwined, and where the most important rites and ceremonies were performed. As Cade and Jorak entered the inner sanctum, Cade felt the weight of the Yavani's gaze upon him. The chamber was filled with members of the Yavani High Council, their multifaceted eyes watching his every move with a mixture of suspicion and skepticism. Among them stood the Yavani chief, Kale's father, a towering figure whose crystalline form was more intricate and radiant than any Cade had seen before. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. At the center of the chamber, lying on a levitating crystal bed, was Kale. The young Yavani child looked fragile and small, her usually vibrant form dimmed to a dull glow. Her skin, once a dazzling array of shifting colors, was now a pale, almost translucent hue, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. But what drew Cade's attention most was the core at the center of her chest, a complex, multifaceted crystal that was the source of her life force. It was fractured, with jagged lines running through it like cracks in a piece of glass. The core flickered weakly, its light fading in and out, a haunting reminder of how close Kale was to slipping away. Cade took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was the most delicate and dangerous repair job he had ever undertaken. The Yavani's crystalline core was a marvel of bioengineering, a perfect blend of organic and inorganic matter that no human truly understood. Even the Yavani themselves treated it with reverence, as it was not just a physical organ, but a spiritual one as well. The idea of a human attempting to repair such a thing was nearly blasphemous to them, yet here he was, their last hope. "I'll need to examine the core up close," Cade said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous chamber. The Yavani chief nodded, and with a gesture he commanded the other Yavani to step back, giving Cade the space he needed. Cade approached Kale's bedside, his tools in hand. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, each one silently judging him, waiting for him to fail. Cade carefully began his examination, using a micro-laser scanner to map the fractures in Kale's core. The scanner's display showed a detailed holographic image of the core, highlighting the numerous cracks and fissures that threatened to tear it apart. Cade's heart sank as he realized the extent of the damage. It was worse than he had anticipated. The core was not just cracked, it was disintegrating from within, the delicate lattice structure collapsing under the strain. "How bad is it?" Jorak asked, his voice low and tense. "Bad," Cade replied, not sugarcoating the truth. "The core is fracturing at an accelerating rate. If we don't stabilize it soon, it will collapse completely, and there will be nothing anyone can do." The room fell silent, the gravity of Cade's words sinking in. Cade knew he had to act quickly, but the task ahead seemed almost impossible. The core was far too delicate for conventional repair methods. If he applied too much pressure or energy, it would shatter. If he didn't do enough, it would continue to deteriorate. The balance had to be perfect. Cade ran through his options, his mind racing. He needed a way to fuse the fractures without causing further damage. Traditional welding or sealing methods were out of the question. The core's structure was too intricate for anything so crude. But then an idea began to form in Cade's mind, an idea that was as risky as it was innovative. "I'm going to use nanobots to repair the core," Cade said, turning to Jorak and the chief. "They're small enough to navigate the fractures without causing additional damage. I'll program them to fuse the crystal at a molecular level, reinforcing the structure from the inside out." The Yavani council members exchanged uneasy glances. Nanotechnology was something they were familiar with, but the idea of using it on something as sacred as the core was unprecedented. Yet as they looked at Cade, they could see that he was their only hope. "We will allow it," the chief said finally, his voice calm but laced with the weight of responsibility. "But you must understand, human, that if you fail, there will be consequences." Cade nodded, fully aware of the stakes. He began preparing the nanobots, carefully programming each one with the specific instructions needed to repair the fractures. These nanobots were of his own design, originally intended for repairing crystalline circuits in mining equipment. But Cade had modified them for this task, adding new algorithms that would allow them to adapt to the core's unique structure. As Cade worked, the tension in the room grew thicker. The Yavani watched in silence, their faith in him tenuous at best. Cade could feel their doubt, their fear, but he pushed it aside, focusing entirely on the task at hand. He knew that the slightest mistake could spell disaster. After what felt like hours, Cade was ready. He approached Kale's core, the nanobots housed in a small handheld device. With a deep breath, he activated the device, releasing the nanobots into the air. They swarmed around the core like a cloud of dust, their tiny forms invisible to the naked eye. Cade watched the holographic display, tracking their movements as they entered the fractures and began their work. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the temple's crystalline walls. Then, slowly, the holographic display began to show signs of progress. The nanobots were working, fusing the fractured crystal with incredible precision. Cade could see the fractures closing, the core's structure stabilizing. But the process was slow, agonizingly so. Cade monitored the energy levels of the core, knowing that he had to be careful not to overcharge it. The core was still fragile, and too much energy could cause it to shatter. He adjusted the flow of energy from the nanobots, guiding them with minute precision. As the hours dragged on, Cade's exhaustion began to take its toll. His hands trembled, his eyes strained from staring at the display. But he couldn't stop. Not now. He was so close. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last fracture was sealed. The core was still weak, but it was stable. The nanobots had done their job, and the core's light, though faint, was no longer flickering. Cade let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "It's stable," Cade said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "But we're not out of the woods yet. The core needs time to heal, and we'll have to monitor it closely." The Yavani chief stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He looked at Cade, then at his daughter's now stabilized form. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Cade feared the worst. But then the chief gave a single, solemn nod. "You have done what we could not," the chief said quietly. "But this is only the beginning. You must see this through, human. You must ensure that my daughter lives." Cade nodded, too tired to speak. He knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Stabilizing the core was one thing, reviving Kale's life force was another entirely. But for now, he had bought them time, and that was something. As Cade left the temple, the Yavani watching him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope over an abyss. The pressure of what lay ahead weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had no choice but to continue. He had made a promise, not just to the Yavani, but to himself. And Cade Wallace never backed down from a challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. The temple was quiet as Cade returned to the inner sanctum, a stillness that felt more like a held breath than a moment of peace. The Yavani council had dispersed, leaving only the chief, a few high priests, and Jorak to oversee what would be the most critical phase of Cade's work, reviving Kale's life force. The enormity of the task weighed heavily on Cade, but he knew there was no turning back now. Failure was not an option. Not for him, not for Kale. Kale lay as she had before, her small, crystalline form glowing faintly under the soft lights of the temple. The repairs to her core had stabilized her, but only just. Cade knew that without a way to reignite the core's energy, her life force would eventually fade entirely. The Yavani had already tried everything within their considerable knowledge, but this situation required something beyond tradition, something daring and new. "I have an idea," Cade began, his voice breaking the silence. "But it's risky. If it works, it could save her. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The Yavani understood the stakes as well as he did. The chief's eyes, multifaceted and glowing with a subdued light, locked onto Cade's, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded solemnly. "Tell us what you need, human," the chief said, his voice resonant and filled with a quiet strength. Cade took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. The core needs an infusion of energy, but it has to be the right kind, at the right intensity. Too much and the core could overload. Too little and it won't be enough to reignite her life force. Jorak, who had been quietly observing from the side, stepped forward. "Our technology has limits. What you're suggesting is unprecedented. How do you propose to channel this energy?" Cade turned his gaze toward the temple's massive crystal spire, which extended far above the temple and deep into the planet's crust. He had noticed it during his earlier visit and had since confirmed his suspicions. The spire wasn't just a symbolic structure, it was a conduit, a sophisticated piece of Yavani technology designed to draw energy from the planet's core, a source of almost limitless power. "The spire," Cade said, pointing upward. "It channels energy from the planet's core, doesn't it? I can modify the flow, directing it into Kale's core, but in a controlled manner. We'll use the planet's energy to jumpstart her life force." The room fell into a stunned silence. The Yavani priests exchanged worried glances, their crystalline forms shimmering with an uneasy light. The idea of tampering with the sacred spire, the very heart of their temple and their connection to the planet, was beyond anything they had ever considered. "That is blasphemy," one of the priests hissed, his voice sharp with indignation. "The spire is sacred. It is not to be manipulated by outsiders." But the chief held up a hand, silencing the priest. "And yet we ask this human to save my daughter's life. We cannot demand the impossible and then recoil when he offers us a way. Continue, Cade Wallace." Cade nodded, grateful for the chief's support. He continued, explaining how he would use specialized conduits to connect Kale's core to the spire. The conduits, made from a combination of Yavani crystal and human nanotechnology, would allow him to regulate the energy flow with extreme precision. It was a hybrid solution, one that required the best of both human and Yavani technology. After outlining the plan, Cade asked for the materials he would need. The Yavani provided them without hesitation, though it was clear that they did so with great reluctance. The priests, in particular, seemed deeply uneasy, their every movement tense with apprehension. Cade could understand their fear. He was proposing something that had never been done before, something that could as easily destroy Kale as it could save her. As Cade worked, assembling the conduits and calibrating the energy regulators, the temple remained eerily silent. The Yavani watched him intently, their expressions a mixture of hope and dread. Even Jorak, who had been skeptical of Cade from the beginning, seemed to be holding his breath, as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance Cade was trying to achieve. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, Cade was ready. The conduits were in place, connecting Kale's core to the spire, and the regulators were calibrated to the precise energy levels he had determined would be safe. Cade stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. "This is it," he said quietly. "I'm going to start the energy flow. We'll know almost immediately if it's working." The chief moved closer to Cade, his gaze intense. And if it fails? Cade met the chief's eyes, his expression grim. If it fails, there's no coming back. The core will overload, and Kale, she won't survive. The chief closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of Cade's words. When he opened them again, his expression was one of resigned determination. Do it. Cade nodded and turned to the control panel he had rigged together. His fingers hovered over the controls for a moment, the reality of what he was about to do sinking in. Then, with a deep breath, he activated the energy flow. The change was immediate. The spire above them began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the temple. The conduits glowed with a brilliant light as energy from the planet's core surged through them, directed with pinpoint precision into Kale's core. At first, nothing happened. Kale lay still, her form as fragile and dim as before. But then, slowly, the light within her core began to brighten. Cade's eyes were fixed on the monitors, watching the energy levels carefully. The core's light grew stronger, more steady, and Cade adjusted the flow, keeping it within the safe limits he had calculated. The Yavani watched in awe as Kale's body began to react. Her breathing, once shallow and labored, became deeper, more regular. The faint glow of her skin grew brighter, the colors within her crystalline form shifting and flowing like liquid light. Cade could feel the tension in the room ease slightly, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. Hold steady, Cade murmured to himself, his hands making tiny adjustments to the energy flow. Come on, Kale, stay with me. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The core was now fully alight, pulsing with energy and a steady rhythm. Cade dared to hope that it was working, that Kale was coming back to them, but the final test was yet to come. The moment when he would have to push the core to its full capacity to fully reignite her life force. Now, Cade said, more to himself than anyone else. He increased the energy flow, watching as the core's light intensified. The monitors beeped as the core approached critical levels, the readouts flashing warnings. Cade ignored them, trusting in his calculations and his instincts. This was the moment of truth. The core flared with a blinding light, and for a terrifying second, Cade thought it might shatter. But then, the light stabilized, flowing through Kale's body in a wave of energy that lifted her off the bed. Her eyes snapped open, glowing with a brilliance that matched the core itself. The entire temple was bathed in the light, and the Yavani gasped in unison. Kale's body arched upward, suspended in midair by the sheer force of the energy coursing through her. Cade quickly reduced the energy flow, gradually bringing her back down to the bed. The core's light remained strong, its rhythm steady, as Kale settled back onto the crystal surface, her eyes still glowing but now filled with awareness. "She's awake," Jorak whispered, his voice filled with awe. Cade stepped back, his legs suddenly weak with exhaustion and relief. He watched as Kale blinked, her glowing eyes focusing on her father, who had rushed to her side. The chief's normally stoic expression was one of pure, unrestrained joy. "Kale," the chief murmured, his voice trembling. "My daughter." Kale smiled weakly, her hand reaching out to touch her father's face. The temple erupted in cheers, the Yavani priests who had been so skeptical now praising the miracle they had just witnessed. But Cade barely heard them. He was too exhausted to join in the celebration. His vision blurred, and he swayed on his feet. Jorak caught him as he started to collapse, easing him down to the floor. "You did it, Cade," Jorak said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "You saved her." Cade managed a tired smile. "Yeah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did." As the Yavani gathered around Kale, celebrating her revival, Cade let his eyes close, giving in to the exhaustion that had been building since he started this impossible task. He had done what no one believed he could do. He had revived the alien child, defying the odds and earning the respect of a species that had once regarded him as an outsider. And as darkness claimed him, Cade felt a deep sense of peace. He had done the impossible, and for once he felt like he truly belonged. When Cade awoke, it was to the soft light filtering through the crystalline walls of a Yavani chamber. The ceiling above him shimmered with a calming blue glow, reminiscent of an Earth-like sky at dawn. He blinked, disoriented, as memories of the previous day came flooding back, the intensity of the operation, the overwhelming relief of seeing Cale revived, and finally, the bone-deep exhaustion that had overtaken him. He tried to sit up, but a gentle hand on his shoulder eased him back down. It was Jorik, his crystalline skin now reflecting hues of gratitude and concern. Cade noticed that he was no longer in the temple but in a room that looked like it was meant for recovery. "Easy, Cade," Jorik said, his voice softer than Cade had ever heard it. "You've been out for nearly a full cycle. Your body needed rest after what you did." Cade nodded, grateful for the bed beneath him and the calm around him. He could feel the lingering ache in his muscles, a reminder of the strain he had put himself through. But there was also a deep satisfaction, knowing that he had accomplished what he had set out to do. "How's Cale?" Cade asked, his voice rough from disuse. Jorik's face lit up with a rare smile. "She is well, better than well, in fact. The core has fully stabilized, and her life force is strong. She's already walking around, curious about everything. The chief hasn't left her side since she woke." A wave of relief washed over Cade, and he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was over. The impossible task was complete, and Cale was safe. "Where is she now?" Cade asked, eager to see the child he had fought so hard to save. Jorik helped Cade to his feet, steadying him as he stood. "She's in the Great Hall with her father. They've been waiting for you to wake." As Jorik led him through the temple's crystalline corridors, Cade noticed that the atmosphere had changed. The Yavani they passed nodded to him respectfully, their previous wariness replaced with something warmer, more open. It wasn't just relief that Cale was alive. It was respect for the human who had defied the odds to save her. The Great Hall was a vast, awe-inspiring space, filled with the same shimmering light that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the planet itself. The ceiling arched high above, reflecting the colors of the spire as it channeled energy from the planet's core. In the center of the hall stood Cale and her father, surrounded by Yavani of all ranks. The moment Cade entered, all eyes turned to him, and a hush fell over the crowd. Cale's face lit up when she saw Cade, and she broke free from her father's side, running to him with the exuberance of a child fully restored. Cade knelt down, and she threw her arms around his neck, her crystalline skin cool and smooth against his own. "Thank you," Cale whispered, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "You saved me." Cade felt a lump in his throat as he hugged her back. "I'm just glad you're okay, Cale." The Yavani chief approached them, his usually stoic expression softened with emotion. When Cale released Cade, the chief extended a hand to help him to his feet. Cade accepted it, feeling the strength and warmth in the chief's grip. "You have done more than save my daughter's life," the chief said, his voice resonating with the authority of a leader and the gratitude of a father. "You have shown us that trust can be placed in those we do not fully understand, that collaboration can achieve what tradition alone cannot. For that, you have earned a place of honor among my people." Cade, unused to such praise, felt a flush of embarrassment. "I only did what needed to be done. Anyone else in my place would have tried the same." The chief shook his head. "Do not diminish what you have accomplished. The path you took was one that none of us would have dared to walk. It required more than skill. It required courage, innovation, and a willingness to defy convention. These are qualities we Yavani value deeply, even if we do not always recognize them in others." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled Yavani. Cade could feel the weight of their respect, and it was almost overwhelming. He had spent so long as an outcast, doubted and dismissed, that this sudden shift was hard to process. But there was no denying the sincerity in their eyes, the genuine respect they were offering him. As the chief continued, his tone became more formal. "Cade Wallace, it is the decision of this council that you be offered a place among our most esteemed engineers, an honor never before extended to a human. You will be granted access to our knowledge, our technology, and our resources to continue the work you have begun here. But more than that, you will be considered a friend to the Yavani people, a bridge between our worlds." Cade was stunned. The offer was more than he had ever dreamed of. Access to Yavani technology and knowledge was priceless, something that could revolutionize human understanding of the universe. But it was the last part of the chief's offer that struck him the most, the idea that he could help forge a new relationship between humans and the Yavani, one built on mutual respect and collaboration. For a moment, Cade considered accepting the offer, the chance to learn, to innovate, to work alongside the best minds of the Yavani was incredibly tempting. But then, as he looked around at the Great Hall, at the smiling faces of Kale and the other Yavani, he realized that his journey had always been about more than just personal achievement. It was about bringing people and species together. "Thank you," Cade said, his voice steady. "I'm honored by your offer, truly, but I believe that my role is not to stay here, but to help create something new, something that benefits both our peoples." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I propose we establish a joint human-Yavani research facility here on Dreykus 4, a place where our engineers, scientists, and healers can work together, sharing knowledge and ideas. We can learn so much from each other, and together we can prevent tragedies like Kale's from ever happening again." There was a moment of silence as the Yavani Council considered Cade's proposal. The chief's eyes shone with approval as he regarded Cade, and after a brief exchange of glances with the other council members, he nodded. "That is a wise and noble idea, Cade Wallace," the chief said. "Let it be so. A new facility will be built, and it will stand as a symbol of our unity and shared purpose." The great hall erupted in applause, the Yavani embracing the idea with enthusiasm. Cade felt a surge of pride, not just for what he had accomplished, but for what it represented. This was more than just a personal victory. It was the beginning of a new era of cooperation and understanding between two very different cultures. In the weeks that followed, Cade worked tirelessly with both Yavani and human engineers to establish the new facility. It was a massive undertaking, but one that was met with excitement and optimism. The building itself was a marvel of combined engineering, blending Yavani crystalline structures with human technology in a way that was both functional and beautiful. The research facility became a hub of innovation, attracting the brightest minds from across the galaxy. New medical techniques were developed, new technologies were invented, and a bond was forged between humans and Yavani that went beyond treaties and agreements. It was a true partnership, built on the trust and respect that had grown from Cade's impossible feat. As the years passed, Cade became a legend on Dreykus 4 and beyond. His story was told and retold, inspiring countless others to challenge the boundaries of what was possible, to embrace collaboration over competition, and to see the value in every being, regardless of species or background. But through it all, Cade remained humble. He continued to work in his workshop, tinkering with machines and exploring new ideas. He never sought out the spotlight, content to let others take the credit for the facility's many successes. For Cade, the greatest reward was knowing that he had made a difference, that he had helped build a bridge between two worlds. And so, the man who had once been an outcast, a lonely mechanic on a distant mining colony, became a symbol of what could be achieved when trust and innovation came together. Cade Wallace had done the impossible, not just by reviving an alien child, but by changing the course of history for both humans and Yavani. In the end, his legacy was not just in the machines he fixed or the lives he saved, but in the bonds he helped forge and the future he helped create. And that, Cade knew, was the greatest achievement of all.